Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
The Forgotten Revenge for Pearl Harbor. At 7:55 a.m. Hawaii time, a Japanese dive bomber bearing the red symbol of the rising sun of Japan on its wings appears out of the clouds above the island of Oahu. A swarm of 360 Japanese warplanes followed, descending on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in a ferocious assault. The surprise attack struck a critical blow against the U.S. Pacific Fleet and drew the United States irrecoverably into World War II. Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? And what happened after it? What did America do to Japan after Pearl Harbor? Before we answer these questions, make sure to smash the like button, subscribe to our channel, and click the notification bell for more amazing videos. After more than 75 years, a question remains for students of the history of World War II. Why did Japan attack Pearl Harbor? The attack of Pearl Harbor ranks as the most successful military surprise attack in the early years of combined naval-aerial combat. On December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service struck the United States naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii Territory. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, directly caused America's entry to World War II, which led to the eventual launch of the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, an outcome that spelled disaster for the Japanese. The Japanese managed to damage almost 20 U.S. naval vessels, of which 8 large battleships, 200 airplanes, and killing over 2,000 Americans. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor for 3 reasons. Reason number 1, an increased need for natural resources. Japan had an increased need for natural resources like oil, minerals, and steel as their goals for expansion in Asia and the Pacific increased. Reason number 2, the United States also had an obvious interest in these natural resources, and in response to the Japanese aggression, the U.S. Congress placed restrictions on doing business with Japan. And if that weren't enough, Japanese assets in the United States were frozen. Reason number 3, expansion in the Pacific. President Roosevelt moved the U.S. Pacific Fleet from California to Pearl Harbor in 1939. This move was a threat to Japan, who wanted to expand in the Pacific. Military leaders and politicians saw war between the U.S. and Japan as inevitable, with the solution being to attack first. Japan did just that. There are 3 reasons why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Many people believe that the Japanese were successful in their attack. They took the lives of more than 2,500 Americans and destroyed 18 ships and about 300 airplanes. But the result of the attack did not enable Japan to expand in the Pacific. It did not result in the acquisition of more natural resources, and the restrictions were not lifted as a result of the attack. Doolittle's raiders avenged Pearl Harbor by hitting the Japanese where they least expected it, at home. At noon on April 18, 1942, the citizens of Tokyo looked up into the sky and saw the impossible. Zooming low over the imperial capital was a flight of twin-engine bombers. Nothing surprising about that in wartime Japan, except that these aircraft were painted olive drab, with red, white, and blue stars on their wings and fuselage. There were American planes dropping bombs on the sacred soil of Japan. As the crump of explosions on the drone of aircraft motors faded and the air raid sirens belatedly wailed, Tokyoites asked themselves a fateful question. What just happened? The Doolittle raid 75 years ago was more than one of history's most momentous air attacks. It was also one of the most economical. The Allies dropped 2.7 million tons of bombs on Germany, and the United States dropped 7 million tons on Vietnam. And still, the Nazis and the Communists continued to fight. Yet 16 B-25 bombers carrying perhaps 16 tons of bombs managed to change the course of history. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese launched a surprise attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. After 2 hours of bombing, 21 U.S. ships were sunk or damaged, 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, and 2,403 people were killed. And all of this happened while the U.S. and Japan were officially engaging in diplomatic negotiations for possible peace in Asia. The day after the attack, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed a joint session of the 77th United States Congress, calling December 7 a day which will live in infamy.
A date which will live in infamy.
Within an hour of Roosevelt's speech, Congress declared war on the Empire of Japan amid outrage at the attack, the death of thousands of Americans, and Japan's deception of the United States by engaging in diplomatic talks with the country during the entire event. Pacifist Representative Janet Rankin, a Republican from Montana, cast the only dissenting vote. Roosevelt signed the declaration of war later the same day, continuing to intensify its military mobilization. The U.S. government finished converting to a war economy, a process began by provision of weapons and supplies to the Soviet Union and the British Empire. Japanese Americans from the West Coast were sent to internment camps for the duration of the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor immediately united a divided nation. Public opinion had been moving towards support for entering the war during 1941, but considerable opposition remained until the attack. Overnight, Americans united against the Empire of Japan in response to calls to remember Pearl Harbor. A poll taken between December 12 and 17, 1941, showed that 97% of respondents supported a declaration of war against Japan. Further polling showed a dramatic increase in support for every able-bodied man serving in the military, up to 70% in December 1941. American solidarity probably made possible the unconditional surrender position later taken by the Axis. Some historians, among them Samuel Eliot Morison, believes the attack doomed Imperial Japan to defeat simply because it had awakened the sleeping giant. Regardless of whether the fuel depots or machine shops had been destroyed, or even if the carriers had been caught in port and sunk, America's industrial military capacity, once mobilized, was able to pour overwhelming resources into both the Pacific and European theaters. Others, such as Clay Blair Jr. and Mark Perello, believed Japanese trade protection was so incompetent that American submarines alone might have strangled Japan into defeat. The closest friend Roosevelt had in the developing Allied alliance, Sir Winston Churchill, stated that his first thought regarding American assistance to the United Kingdom was that we have won the war, very soon after Pearl Harbor was attacked. Perceptions of treachery in the attack before a declaration of war sparked fears of sabotage or espionage by Japanese sympathizers residing in the U.S., including citizens of Japanese descent, and was a factor in the subsequent Japanese internment in the western United States. Other factors included misrepresentations of intelligence information suggesting sabotage, notably by General John L. DeWitt, commanding General of Western Defense Command on the Pacific Coast, who harbored personal feelings against Japanese Americans. In February 1942, Roosevelt signed United States Executive Order 9066, requiring all Japanese Americans to submit themselves for internment. Propaganda made repeated use of the attack because its effects was enormous and impossible to counter. Remember Pearl Harbor became the watchwords of the war. The American government understated the damage inflicted in the hope of preventing the Japanese from learning it, but the Japanese had, through surveillance, a good estimate. And that's it for today's video. Don't forget to smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and tell us what you want to see next.